Greetings from my lounge room. I hope the buses keep quiet for a little bit. In God we live and move and have our being. Such a profound statement, it seems to me, in the midst of radical engagement, which reminds me why I continue to wrestle with the great Apostle Paul. Now, the emphasis in that last sentence perhaps surprises you. You might expect it to be under wrestle. Actually, it's under continue. It's stories like this that lead me to continue to engage with Paul in the other moments when I'm confronted by what he's saying. I think that what makes me admire him as I do is the fact that Paul spent a huge part of his post-conversion life, if you like, wrestling with a life and a faith turned upside down by his encounter with Jesus. And I'm not sure that he ever resolved all his questions and contradictions fully. But to quote that old paint company ad, he kept on keeping on. And his legacy to those of us who followed him is the public outworking of his private questions and passions and faithfulness. Speaking for myself, this affirmation and the story around it has become a profoundly important one for how I speak of my faith and how I do my best to live it. I know that you've heard me use that expression many times. In God we live and move and have our being. Now, it's understood that Paul had quite a long period of solitude after his Damascus Road experience, which is described in chapter 9 of Acts. And then, like Jesus after his wilderness experiences, described in the Gospels, Paul had the courage to live in public a life that was a work in progress. And for this, I give deep thanks, even as I wrestle with his conclusions. Now, you'll note that I've used the word wrestle quite a lot already. I'm going to stop now. But it's actually quite a useful way of thinking about Paul's journey of life and faith, just as it was for his ancestor in the faith, Jacob, so many generations before. Now, that's perhaps a long introduction to this story and its wonderful affirmation of faith. But I think it's worth remembering sometimes what we bring to our encounters with Scripture. So let's set the scene. Paul's wandering around Athens waiting for his friends to arrive. As he wanders, he sees all the idols honouring the local gods, and because he's so passionate about his God, the sight distresses him. Now, it's not clear exactly why this is the case, but we sense, or we're meant to sense in this story, that it's a pastoral thing. These people are missing out on something that he holds dear. And so, in true Paul fashion, he gets stuck in to tell them about his God. Predictably, some people are interested, others, no, not so much. But Paul is given a forum to speak. And what happens is quite dramatic and important to note, I think. Firstly, Paul begins where he is and where the people are. Those first words, then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." Now, it strikes me that this is actually a statement of respect, of entering the public world of the Athenians, aware that he is an invited guest. It's also a statement that accepts the reality that all religions are not the same. Paul's not simply being asked to fill in the blanks on their religious page, nor does he do so. The unknown God is the one about which he considers they all need to know. And so, in my humble opinion, he honours them with honesty and passion about that God. But at the same time, he's careful of their beliefs and of his own. He shows that he understands something of their religious experience and that he's familiar with the wise ones, the Greek faiths and cultures, their poets, their artists and writers. And it's in this context that we encounter the phrase with which I begin this witness: in whom we live and move and have our being. That Luke, the writer of Acts, has Paul using this statement says something about Luke's, radical agenda of inclusion. What Paul does with this statement is to use the Greeks' own poets to affirm that this God that they call unknown is actually known. It is the God who draws all of their life and faith together, he says, in a way that goes beyond simply believing in, and is all about their whole being. Respectfully, and yet very assertively, he affirms the God who for him is all there is, in whom everything is. It reminds me, when I read these words, of Moses and the story at the burning bush, where he asks God, "Whom shall I say is sending me? Who should I say you are?" The reply is, "I am. I will be what I will be." Now, in his reflection on this story, Professor Bill Loader, Uniting Church scholar, writes this about the declaration: "In him we live and move and have our being," which Luke's Paul uses to summarise the best of the world's wisdom about God, reflected in its various cultures. The assumption is that we have something in common. People of other faiths and cultures are not in total darkness. This stance, which stands in contrast to some of the rhetoric elsewhere in the New Testament, is a remarkable achievement. Light wears no labels, and wherever it shines, we should recognise that. I love that expression. Light wears no labels. Wherever it shines, we should recognise it. Now, in making this interpretation, Bill Loader is not saying that all religions are the same, and certainly neither does Paul. He's passionate, he's single-minded, dogged even, about his faith and faith experience, and he takes no backward steps in talking about it or living it. But I think it's also important to remember how he goes about it. It seems to me that this is a story of hospitality. It may not seem like it, certainly no food changes hands that we know of, but nonetheless it's a story of hospitality, and mutual hospitality at that. The Greeks offer Paul the hospitality of a forum, and in return he offers them the hospitality of respect. In such a setting, sacred transformation happens for each side. I use the word side carefully. Each party is probably a better expression. They encounter fellow travellers on the path of life and curiosity and seeking of wisdom. And in the encounter they move beyond simply a statement of what a person has to believe in order to be faithful or to be saved, to a conversation about faith as being. And for me, this is the most important part of the story, as important for us today as in Paul's day. And I say that because in much of what I see around me in matters of faith, particularly what I see online, the understanding of belief is radically diminished from what it was in Paul's day, and probably from what it has been for most of Christian history. Until the last 4 centuries or so, the word faith had at least 4 meanings. There was a census, from which we get our word assent, which means you agree to propositions or statements. Excuse me. There was fiducia, radical trust in God. Fidelity comes from there. Also, fidelitas, loyalty in one's relationship to God. And finally, visio, a way of seeing the graciousness and goodness of all there is in the spirit of God's words at each stage of the creation stories. Now, by and large, it seems to me the last 3, or certainly the last 2, have been lost. For many Christians, faith seems to be reduced to the statements to which you need to give assent, usually tied to the notion that if you don't, you won't get into heaven. Now, I'm not saying that assent is unimportant, but I do believe that the obsession with right belief has come at the expense of right imagination and right action. Perhaps worse, it's become a tool for people to decide who is and who isn't included in the people of God. Last time I looked, that wasn't up to us. I find very compelling the words of Robin Myers in this matter, in his very challenging and yet wonderful book, Saving Jesus from the Church. After also affirming the importance of belief, Myers goes on to say this, and I echo with it. The idea of faith so narrowly defined has probably more than anything else driven thoughtful people out of the church. Sadly, the idea of faith as a way of being in the world, instead of a loyalty oath sworn to creeds and doctrines, remains largely unknown to those who have left the church and find no compelling reason to return. If the church does not succeed in restoring the idea of faith as being and not just believing, then the gospel story of Jesus as the heart of God in the flesh will wither and perish. I'm right there with him. I'm right there with Myers because he goes on to say that we can believe all the right things and still be in bondage to all that prevents us being in right relationship with God, with the world, or even ourselves. And in this, I think he stands with both with Jesus and with Paul. Not sure where John got in. When Jesus calls his disciples to believe him, it is to all the senses of belief, not just the one about agreeing with what he says. When Paul invites the Athenian debaters into a conversation about belief, he invites them to do much more than simply adding another set of things they have to accept to the ones they already have. He invites them to be open to a whole new way of imagining, thinking, and being. One which will transform their lives as it has transformed his. He uses their language, their poets, to call them to dream a new way, a new relationship with God, who is everything there is, in whom everything is, in whom we live and move and have our being. It seems to me that it doesn't get a whole lot bigger than that. Blessings.